Hello everyone and welcome to our live chat for Module 3. Today I thought I would try something a little different. It may look a little weird, but there's kind of a method to my madness, if you will. Been noticing some real challenges, probably related to my network, with WebEx recording, so I'm going to try something a little different. I'm going to do a local recording at the same time that we're recording this on WebEx, and then I'll probably share both. So for today's topic, we're going to talk about APA and APA 7th, and basically kind of a high-level overview of the material, what we do, what I've learned over the years, and so I'll kind of basically share my approach for writing papers using APA. So jumping straight in, this is where you want to get started. You want to go to the guides, rasmussen.edu/APA, and it is a pretty good resource. One of the things you'll want to do is utilize that template. The APA 7th edition paper template in Word, that's what you want to use. And it is a student edition of the APA template. What that means is there's some different stuff on the title page, but after that it's pretty much the same as the professional version. But it is the version that Rasmussen has chosen to utilize. So that is your starting point, and that is the template that you should probably use for any kind of papers you're submitting here at Rasmussen. So it's not a bad idea, even if it's something that isn't necessarily all that much about the words that you're writing, it's still not a bad idea. So jumping straight into what is APA, right? So useful to know because the first time I used APA, I tried to fix it because I thought it was ugly and broken. So, well, that can't be right. So I tried to clean it up, and needless to say, my paper had lots of red on it when I got it back. So this is what the title page looks like roughly. So you'll see the title of the paper, and do make that something meaningful that has something to do with the course you're taking and the assignment you're being asked to do. Don't say assignment 1 because it's not terribly descriptive. Rather, make it something that if you were to share it, say as a blog post, or maybe you wrote a book or something, that it would be the title of it so that somebody could tell what it was about by reading the title. Follow that with basically a line, a blank line. Also note that the title is bold, and a few other kind of things to note as well. There is no running head up here in the top. If you're familiar with APA 6, there was the words running head, capital running, and then head, colon, and then all uppercase running head, which was basically a shortened version of the title. For the student version, it's no longer present. You still have the page number upper right-hand corner, but there's no longer a running header up at the top. After your name, the institution that you're affiliated with, probably want to change that to university, so Rasmussen University. Then the course number, colon, and then the course title. So whatever course number it is, followed by the course title. Then my name with my prefix, so Dr. Alan Dennis, and then the assignment's due date. And that's what the title page looks like. Don't make it pretty. It's not meant to be pretty. It's meant to look pretty much like that. So you get past the title page, what's the first page of the paper look like? Again, that same title from the title page repeats on the first line. This first paragraph or so is the introduction. Notice there's no heading that says introduction. We know that because it is the first thing after the title. It is the introduction. So you don't have to say introduction and so on. And then notice also roughly these are 1-inch margins. First line is indented roughly half an inch. And you can do that through a setting that we'll talk about in a little bit later on. Also notice not full justified. It's left justified. Don't make it full because, yeah, that may make it look pretty, but it's not how APA is. And at a gist, that is what your paper should look like at a high level on the style. For the student version of the APA, well, actually for both student and professional, there's no difference on the first page heading or and the subsequent pages. It's all the same now. So it's in a lot of ways much simpler. You also have a few more choices on fonts, but my recommendation is if you do use more than one font, pick one and stick with it because we don't want you introducing a whole lot of different fonts. So make sure that you do, as I said, pick one and use that same one the whole time. And at a gist, that is what the first page looks like. So the next kind of minimalist paper that you might ever potentially turn in has a references page. So 3 pages, basically the first the title page, the second the body of content, so with the title at the top, and then a references page which contains things in this format. And notice the hanging indent, and also that it's double spaced. References is now bold. APA 6th, that was not. APA 7th, it is bold. It's treated pretty much the same as every other heading in a paper. So keep that in mind, that basically you make it a heading level 1 and bin life is pretty good. And that is kind of the gist of what APA looks like. You may sometimes see the words abstract. The short answer is don't do it. Several reasons for that. An abstract is hard. That's the first reason. And you don't do it unless you're told to do it, is the second kind of reason. If one is required, the instructor will tell you that it's required, and there is a particular length that they're going to be looking for, typically somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 to 200 words. It is one paragraph with no indentation. You have sometimes keywords at the bottom of it, so that indicates the nature of the paper. And as I just said several times, don't do it unless you're asked to do it. If you're in doubt, ask your instructor if they want an abstract for this course. And pretty much any course I'm going to teach, I don't want an abstract. They're not appropriate for a lot of the work that we do in much of the undergraduate and even graduate work. The idea of an abstract, though, is that if you are to do one, and say maybe you're writing your dissertation and you want an abstract because you have to have one, the purpose of that is to basically outline the whole point of the paper, the thesis statement, the research question, if you have one, the problems you're addressing, also what it is you did or do as a result of what it is the whole point of that paper is. So what was the purpose, followed by what it was the outcome. So what did you learn about it? What was the findings in a very abbreviated form. So you're going to do all of that in roughly 150 to 200 words. Not easy. So again, only do it if you're told to, because it is marginally painful. So I'm going to now shift over kind of to like the writing process, and this is my process. I'm not an English teacher, so what I'm saying may not be right, but it's been good enough to get me A's most of the time on a paper. So, in fact, pretty much every time. So it is something that you might want to emulate for that very reason alone. So we'll go ahead and go through it. Again, this is what I do, not necessarily what you may find. But there's a basic concept to understand. There is this concept of introduction, content, conclusion. And that pattern follows at several levels. It applies to the entire paper, for one. So your entire paper should have an introductory paragraph. That paragraph will include things like a thesis statement and so on. Then it'll have the body of the paper, which is what's being done to essentially address the thesis statement. So the point. So you're filling in the whole purpose of the paper is basically meeting the expectation that you're setting in that introduction. And then at the end, you have a conclusion. So you wrap it up. And it also applies not just at a paper level, because it clearly should, and everything you write should have an introduction and a conclusion and a body. It's that simple. It doesn't really, if it's an email, it really should be there. If it's a letter to your boss, definitely should be there. It is something that is a good practice. In part, you're stating the purpose up front so people know what the context of it is. You're saying what you got to say, and then you're reinforcing them and potentially giving them the takeaways of what it is the ask is. What is it you want the reader to do in the case of a paper, or to understand, or to think about, or to consider? In the case of something like an email, it's what do you want somebody else to do? Do you want their help? Do you need to inform them? Whatever it is. So being very explicit with that pattern is incredibly powerful. It also applies within a section of a paper. So if you have a paper that has multiple headings inside of it, which is an organizational unit that you'll probably want to use, headings allow you to essentially tell the reader explicitly what it is they're reading is where it is in the outline. And that's literally what you're doing. You're taking your outline, you're turning it into some headings, and then you're filling in the blocks between those headings so that everywhere between each one of the headings you have at least a paragraph, and that paragraph is there to address the purpose of that heading, and so on. So it definitely applies there. So whenever you have a section that's underneath of a heading, your first paragraph inside of that section should explain the purpose of that section, what it is that you're going to talk about, and outline a little bit of foreshadowing of what's coming inside of that region. It also applies at a paragraph. We use a little bit of a different terminology at the paragraph level. We talk about a topic sentence instead of some of the other things, but you should at the same time, and there's this thing called the meal plan, I believe it's out of Duke University, where you introduce the main idea, you present your evidence and analysis, and then you do essentially a conclusion. You wrap it up. You link it together, pull it together, and then prepare the reader for the next paragraph in the paper. So it's very much an iterative sort of recursive process to consider. So just something to think about. It served me pretty well when I started thinking of things that way. It also somewhat takes away some of the guesswork, so you know what to write when, right? So it's not necessarily mechanical, but it's certainly formulaic. So the thesis statement, that's the whole point of your paper, and the subtopics, that's kind of what you're going to do to address that thesis statement. You really need to get those right to start with, and it's not as hard as it might sound like. The thesis statement can be a sort of a variation of the assignment's parameters. And then the subtopics could be the sub-elements that are required to be addressed inside of that paper. It could be that simple. And oftentimes it is that simple. But without a thesis statement, it's really hard to make all the other stuff flow right, because whenever you evaluate a paper, one of the things you evaluate is how well is the thesis statement being supported by the argument that's presented in the paper? If you don't have a clear and recognizable thesis statement, how can I tell if it's being supported or not as the reader and the grader? So you definitely have to start with that thesis statement. It's not as hard as it sounds, but it is really important. And without it, it's really hard to write a good paper. Your subtopics are typically going to correspond to your heading level ones inside of your paper, or if you're doing an outline, it's the top level elements of your outline. And so the whole point of those subtopics is to essentially support the thesis statement, to prove whatever it is you're proving, argue whatever you're arguing, or explain whatever it is you're explaining. So again, you start with that topic and thesis statement, and then you want to make sure that if it's an assignment, you capture all of the parts of the assignment. It sounds like an obvious thing to state, right? Make sure that you're doing all that you're asked to do, but you wouldn't believe how many papers I've seen, even at a doctoral level, where the students are just simply ignoring portions of the assignment and not bothering to do what they're asked to do. So whenever you're grading with a rubric, the first thing you do is say, is the stuff that's in this rubric in that paper? And if it's not, then it's really challenging. So make sure that you essentially convert the assignment into basically a rough outline. There's several ways to do that. You can either do it as a proper outline using, bullets and all that good stuff, or you could take it straight to heading level ones and twos, depending upon the level of nesting you need to do. You always start off with a heading level one. I've seen some papers where people turn them in that maybe it's because the title is centered at the top of the paper, they want to go to the left-hand corner, which is a heading level two. Your heading level ones are always centered in bold, just like the title of the paper. And they're there so that they're easy to find. You can skim straight down and see where they're at. And there's kind of a reason for it. Heading level twos will go to the left. Again, they're bold, but it's aligned to the left, not centered. And most of the time, for most papers you're going to write, 1 and 2 is really all you need. The basic rules apply to headings as they do to outline bullets. Don't have just a single heading level 2 underneath of a heading level 1. You need 2 of them, otherwise you need to merge it together. So there should be 2 points underneath of something in order to have it. By that same argument, you wouldn't have a single heading level 1, but you're probably going to already have at least 2, because you're going to have your introductory sentence or your introductory paragraph. Once you complete it, you probably have something that is kind of the body. You're not going to call it that, but you're going to say background or relevance or material or something. And then you're going to have a conclusion. So you've got at least 2, so you're good to go. But make sure that you don't have one heading level 2 underneath of a heading level 1. It's just not appropriate. Do always include a paragraph that is the introduction. We've talked about that, and it should definitely include that thesis statement. Always have a conclusion section as well, and make sure that it restates the thesis statement. It restates the subtopics that were addressed, but it usually does it, I do anyway, in past tense, where I'm basically saying, I told you this stuff, right? So I I restate the thesis statement that something is important or whatever it is. And then I say, here are the reasons or the things that were talked about that addressed it. And then typically the only real difference between the introduction and conclusion, other than tense a lot of times for my papers, is kind of a takeaway that I'm going to add on at the end. Generally speaking, if you follow that pattern, you'll do pretty well. Some teachers may have different opinions. They may mark it up and so on, but most of the time it's good enough. If you do make claims of any sort, make sure you cite those claims. So if you say there are 5 million widgets that are murdered every year, then make sure you have some explanation as to where 5 million widgets getting murdered every year came from. And maybe also talk about how you can murder a widget, which would be interesting. Make sure you do cite every claim you make, though. So if it's something that's beyond what is considered well established in the field of study that the paper is about, you don't need to say the sky's blue, because it's reasonable agreed that most of the time the sky's blue unless it's cloudy, and then it's not. But generally speaking, if it's anything that is in any way controversial, make sure you support it with some sort of a claim. There's 2 or 3 reasons for that. One, it allows the reader to go and check theirself. 2, you're giving credit to the people that did that thought, had that idea, did that research to prove something to be true. Now, if it's something you've done, that's a different conversation. But if it's something that you're making a claim based upon somebody else's work or evidence, rather than sharing it as your opinion, which has no place in this kind of writing, you need to have a source and cite it. On the first use of a source, you only cite it again if you start another paragraph or you have another source in that same paragraph. Don't cite on every sentence that references the same source. That's called overcitation. It's explicitly addressed in the APA manual in version 7. Don't do it. So instead, you cite on the first use of a source, and then you only cite again if there's some sort of confusion or ambiguity about what source it is you might be talking about. You don't have to cite every sentence. I see that from time to time. People probably are being concerned about thinking it's plagiarism, but if you read the section in the APA manual that talks about paraphrasing long sections, you'll see that it's not desirable. And in fact, it's really hard to read something with a citation on every sentence, especially the same one. It gets really annoying really quick. So please don't oversight. So once you've got this stub of a paper, you want to go do some research. Usually you go to the university library. You may go to scholar.google.com, and then you search for something. So imagine you're searching for something that deals with IT security policy implementation challenges. So those are some search terms you might use to address that kind of problem. Generally speaking, your publications need to be both peer reviewed. That means they've been through a peer review process and are viewed as being reasonably scholarly. They've also are typically less than 5 years old unless they're the seminal work. The seminal work is kind of the first time somebody said something, and it's kind of important. And you don't want to give somebody the credit for some idea that came from someone else. So that's the whole point, is accurate attribution of thoughts and ideas, and making sure that the person that is being credited is the right person, and making sure that you're not inadvertently taking credit for somebody else's work. And that's kind of the whole point of this, is to avoid that sort of confusion. And you basically will repeat this process over and over again. You'll go find a source. You'll do some reading of the abstract. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but that's kind of the pattern. You don't typically read something that is a paper that you find in the library that's a scholarly article, and maybe not even a textbook. You don't typically read it start to finish. In the case of a journal article, you're going to read the abstract first, and kind of get a sense of what the point is, because again, if it's a well-written paper, that abstract should tell you the point of it, the thesis statement, essentially the research topic, the problem they're trying to address, the domain it exists in, the methodology they utilized during their research, and what the results were. So that in a nutshell is everything you need to know. So you start there, but that's not all you do. After you've done that, I generally go and take a look at the conclusion, and also potentially the introduction, maybe in either one of those orders. Rarely do I read the entire paper. Generally speaking, the way that papers are structured is you start off with, if it's a well-written one, an abstract, then an introduction, then there's usually some form of a literature review where they talk about things that have been done in that field. And then after that, they start moving into what they did. So what was their methodology they utilized? Who was involved in their study, if it's a people-based sort of thing? and then what was the results, and then typically maybe what was the application, or maybe why did they get those results, and then sometimes in there's areas of future research and then limitations and so on. But whenever you're taking a look at one of these sources, if you see something like typos, move on, right? Because that tells you two or three things. One, the author didn't review it very strenuously. Secondly, the person who, or people, not person, people who did the peer review didn't flag it. And then the editor of the journal didn't catch it. So probably not a good idea, right? So probably not a real great source. So I usually go through, take a look at the where it's published. So what is it a reputable journal? Does it seem reputable? Is it truly peer reviewed? So on. Uh, who is the authors of the publication associated with or affiliated with? It's very difficult to publish a paper without some sort of academic association. You might be able to if you work for certain companies, like if you work at Microsoft, you probably can get something published, especially if you're working in the research department. But if you work at some relatively small uh, maybe software vendor that does work with consulting companies or something, or consulting to companies, may be very challenging to get it published because you're not associated with a reputable or highly regarded, maybe it is reputable, but highly regarded institution. So check and see who they work for. And if it's some of the bigger schools that are in the field, then yeah, it's, Berkeley, MIT, Caltech, Carnegie Mellon, probably okay, right? But if it's somebody else, maybe not. But it's kind of a weighting system, and you figure out how good something is. Then you take a look, does the methodology seem reasonable? Is it reasonably well written? Can you find the point and the findings really quickly? If it's not, then it wasn't really well written. And if it does all that, then you keep moving and maybe use portions of it to fill out your outline, and you repeat this process over and over again until essentially your outline's full. Moving on to the humble paragraph. It's an important piece. And part of the reason is paragraphs are the building blocks of your paper, basically. You could think of it as a brick, right, that is building a wall that is your paper. The first sentence of the paragraph should be the topic sentence. It should be the point. What is the point of this paragraph? I should be able to tell by reading the first sentence. It's not a mystery novel. I shouldn't have to kind of figure out what you're trying to say. It should be very evident, and it should be in that first sentence. It may or may not have a citation, kind of depends on if you're making a claim. Sometimes you'll, in that first sentence, the point of that paragraph depends upon evidence that you need to introduce. And if you do that, then you need a citation. I've had many arguments with various instructors over the years about that, but now that I'm the instructor, I can say that's how it should be. But if you don't make a claim, then your first sentence should be the topic sentence, and it shouldn't necessarily, you're not necessarily making a claim, then you're going to probably start introducing evidence in your second and third sentence. And so that's where the citations come in. So it all depends if there's a claim or not. If you do make a sentence or a claim or introduce evidence, then you need to essentially do some analysis and evidence sort of kind of stuff. So you take the evidence that's being presented, you analyze it in a way so that you take it and draw conclusions from that evidence in light of the position that you're using it to reinforce. And then basically the last sentence should kind of wrap it all together. You may be having multiple citations in the second through the next to the last sentence in a paragraph, and some types of writing you have a citation literally on every sentence from a different source because you're making an argument based upon the utilization of multiple sources. But the last sentence should not have a citation because you should be pulling it all together. You're wrapping it up, you're concluding and solidifying your position and preparing the reader for the next paragraph, or you're wrapping it up if it's the end of the section or the paper. So why do we care about paragraphs? Kind of went over that. It's the heart of the paper. Sentences are the building blocks of a paragraph. You need to have citations on those sentences, especially if you're making claims. Sometimes it's easier to write 5 to 10 paragraphs than it is to write 1,000 words. So it's almost that, how do you eat an elephant, a bite at a time, right? So it's that kind of mentality of reducing the unit of work to something that is attainable, which is a paragraph, and then you write multiple paragraphs in an orderly way, and before you know it, you've written a paper. So some sentence rules. Academic writing is about clarity and precision. It's about making it very clear what it is you're having to say, so you avoid ambiguous words like they. Who is they? Or she? Who is she? In general, you want it to be very clear whom it is you're speaking of, or what it is you're talking about. It could be could mean lots of different things. So you typically will want to make sure it's very clear. That's not to say you don't ever use those words, but you do so in a way to where it's obvious to the reader what it is you're referring to. You don't use contractions. You use the longer word do not. And that's, again, about avoiding confusion, because it may get confusing to the reader if you're not careful. But it's also just, it's the rules. You don't do that. A sentence should have a single thought. Generally speaking, there's always exceptions to everything, but generally speaking, a sentence should be one point. And use Grammarly. It will help you. Grammarly is a great tool, good for analysis, helps you become a better writer by pointing out the things you're not doing very well and could do better. So consistently using it, you will become a better writer, somewhat in spite of yourself, perhaps. And I've gotten reasonably good at addressing most of the most common ones that I see. Unclear antecedent, you'll see that one a fair amount. That means that you need to say what something is. So this is when you'll typically see it. So you use the word this. This is the problem. And so what is this, right? And that's what the unclear antecedent is. You don't necessarily know what this is. So if you say this characteristic is the problem, you've just made the antecedent very clear. So that's just an example. You'll learn a lot more of those on your own as you utilize it and let it correct you. Paragraphs should basically be one kind of overall concept. You may have different ideas across different sentences, but they should all stitch together and make sense. Generally speaking, they're 3 to 5 sentences. So why 3? Well, you've got your topic sentence, which is the very first sentence. You've got something that is supporting evidence and doing some analysis. That's at least 1 sentence. And then you've got your concluding sentence where you're wrapping things up. So it's at least 3. It will have at least typically a single citation, depending upon where it is. Generally speaking, you don't have citations in your introduction unless you're making a claim to, like, establish evidence or importance or relevance or something like that. So generally speaking, no citations in your introduction or in your conclusion, because your conclusion is similar to your introduction. You're just kind of restating what it is that you've said. So you don't want to be introducing something new that you're having to defend with a citation at the very end of the paragraph, or the very end of the paper, because that's kind of like that one more question sort of attitude where you're walking out the door and you have one more question. You've already kind of wrapped everything up. Don't be introducing new stuff. And you'll want to use the meal plan. And what's that? You say, well, I introduced it a little bit earlier. It came from Duke University. The meal plan is an acronym, stands for main idea, evidence, analysis, and then lead out. So meal plan probably is also helpful because college students sometimes think about meal plans. Sometimes that's the important part of going to college. But the basic idea is that you want to introduce the main idea. That's the point of the paragraph. This is the topic sentence. It's not mystery, so don't make me hunt for it. It should be very clear, and it should have a central idea, and that's basically the idea that's introduced in the first paragraph or the first sentence. It should have evidence and analysis. This is things that are supporting that main idea and also showing how they fit together. Analysis isn't an opinion. It shows how the evidence relates to your claim. So it's not that you think something is some way. It is that it is because of this logical reasoning. And evidence requires the citation, so keep that in mind. Then you want to link it together to the larger topic of what you're talking about, and then you want to link the results and evidence and analysis, kind of pull it all together, and you want to ideally lead into the next paragraph. So how can you tell when you did a good job? The short answer is, well, is it easy to understand? And that sounds like kind of an obvious thing to say, but you'd be surprised how many times people are less concerned with their readers understanding what they have to say than they are, I don't know, sounding scholarly or something. So make sure it is clear that the reader can tell what the point is. That's the first thing. So why does that paragraph exist? Is there evidence present? Was it analyzed? Is it tied together? Does it lead you into the next sort of sentence or the next sort of paragraph? Understanding this is a journey. We're not all great writers immediately. I continually try to improve my writing. I suspect you'll find that you will need to as well over time. Could it be that you've arrived? I have not. I continually find areas where I can improve. So an example of what not to do is copy a source from copy from some source into a paragraph. Use synonym replacement to make it to where it'll get past the citation or the plagiarism detection software. Fail to do a citation to say where you got it from, and then basically uh, think that you've somehow created something new. A thought and the ordering of ideas is an abstract thing, but it is as much the author's work as are the actual words they utilized. So plagiarism is not just about plagiarizing the exact words. It's not about getting past the plagiarism detection software. It's about accurately attributing to someone the work that they did. And also not trying to take credit for something that you didn't do. And frankly, if you do some sort of synonym replacement, it becomes real obvious. So here's an example from Wikipedia, taking the phrase plagiarism as a wrongful appropriation and so on, running that through and doing some enough replacement that it would probably get past most plagiarism scanning software, although they are getting better. And basically replacing wrongful appropriation to adoption and theft and book versus publication. So a lot of people that do this sort of thing aren't great with English and understanding the nuances of the different meanings of words that in one situation may be appropriate synonyms and in others they are not. So this is an example of what not to do. I'm sure we won't have it. If it comes up, you first of all, the reader is going to tell. It's obvious when you read those sort of works. It is academic dishonesty. It's not acceptable at a graduate level of school, and it's certainly not your thoughts. And it may cause you to fail or worse. So just don't do it. Paragraph resources. Those are all fairly decent. Duke, pretty good stuff. And also the Rasmussen is pretty good. Tips and hints, use reference management. Don't do it by hand and don't use words reference tracking. The reason being, it doesn't always get it right. So use something like EndNote or Zotero, especially if you have a lot of references. In a course like this, you probably won't have that many, but if you were to have a lot, you definitely want to use some sort of reference tool. EndNote and Zotero are both good. They integrate with Word, make it easy to import things from various sources via RIS or EndNote exports. You still have to double check them because garbage in, garbage out, right? So you want to make sure that you fix it so that it is appropriate for APA. That is a thing unto itself, as is tone of communication, the way that you cite statistics, the way that you cite data sets. All that stuff has a certain way to do it. It's not just about parenthetical citation. It's a bigger thing than that. You do want to use a Word template and basically heading level ones for your major elements. In this case, if you were writing a paper on the security implementation I mentioned earlier, you probably have something like definition, major elements, importance, challenges, and conclusion. There's not a heading level one for APA in APA for introduction, so don't include one. It might be in your outline. It should not be a heading level one in your paper. The first paragraph under the title is always the introduction. And generally speaking, you want to make sure that the title page is on the cover and first page of content is exactly the same, and it should be descriptive and so on. Do use the APA template as I mentioned earlier. So going into that example in a little more detail, imagine you're asked to write 300 to 400 words discussing IT security policy implementations, define the concepts and provide its major elements, describe the importance and challenges during implementation, and at least 3 scholarly sources. So your outline looks roughly like that. The thesis statement is basically IT security implementation, policy implementation will be defined, explored, and so on. It's basically just restating what's the point of the paper. Then the outline is essentially the elements that were asked for in the assignment. Then you would start thinking about a title. Might look something like this. The no running head up at the top. You do have a page number, however. The title, an overview of information technology security implementation. It's not a bad one. It's not a great one. Probably good enough. Make sure you put your name on, the university that you're affiliated with, the course and code, and make sure it's written out. The date should be written out as it's written out here, fully written out, not 12/25/2020 or something. And the instructor's title should be included in that as well. If unknown, ask. Uh, One important thing to consider, Word can make a lot of this stuff easy for you. That's why partly you want to use a Word template. The entire paper should have the first line set to being special. The only exception to that is the references and the abstract if being used. Everything should be double spaced. Everything should be left aligned. And again, don't have a heading for introduction. Here's a rough sketch of what that would look like. Notice there's no introduction. There is a title at the beginning. I've given myself some notes as to what I want to do, and those are the high level, heading level ones that are going to be involved. Then I would go out and do some research. I find something that looks interesting. I go ahead and export it to something like EndNote, and that downloads, even if you're using Zotero, downloads an RS file that can be imported. Also, you go through and take a look at the abstract, the findings, conclusions. Is it a viable source? Only cite it if it's new. Only cite what is new in the article. This is important and something that is often misunderstood. Don't cite something that they're citing somebody else for. That's called double citation or indirect citation or secondary citation. It's not a good thing. Instead, cite the conclusions or some argument that they're making in their paper, but not something where they're saying somebody else said this, so I agree with that. That you want to go to the original source and cite that source instead. And that's a valid way of doing research, is to go find a paper that has a good literature review of a particular domain, basically taking a look at all the sources that they used, and go do your own research of those sources and then draw your own conclusion. If for some reason you utilize it in the same order, in the same fashion as they did, you probably better give them a citation at the beginning or the end or somewhere, because you've essentially used their thoughts in the same order. So that would be one kind of exception. But generally speaking, you wouldn't want to do that anyway. You want to let it inform your research, but not necessarily totally guide it. Here's an example of an article that's related pretty well to the topic that I was searching for. I've highlighted up in the upper level here. This paper argues, and that tells you right there, this paper, that tells you this is the thesis statement right there. It tells you that this is the point of what it is that is why they wrote it, and what it is that all of this should be relating to. They also outline kind of some of the other things in here. One of the things that it's putting forward is an important mechanism for protecting organizations' information assets is formulated. So that's kind of its contribution to the body of knowledge. That's also important to know as well. You take a look at the conclusion, see that it does reinforce again the restatement of kind of a point of the thesis statement with some additional color. And also it's outlining kind of the results of their research as well. But the conclusion should definitely restate the thesis statement. It shows what was done and also gives some key takeaways. You can learn a lot by reading other people's papers of how to write good papers, especially if you're able to tell the difference between a good one and a not so good one. And I learned a lot during my research of finding somebody that wrote a good paper and then, well, what made that a good paper? So something to consider. Here's an example of a paragraph from that source. Not the most riveting thing you're ever going to read, but it's not bad. I basically state kind of that attempts have been made to address inconsistency in IT security policy implementation by creating frameworks to manage policy life cycles, and that gave them credit. The second sentence there is going to that citation as well, or that source as well. And so make sure that you do define any acronyms like IT before you use them by themselves. Also, generally speaking, you shouldn't define them unless you're going to use them again. I don't know if I necessarily followed that rule here. Cite in the first sentence if you're making a claim. Don't, typically speaking, avoid quotations unless it is under some really special circumstances. And if you do quotations, make sure that you do so in the appropriate format. Once you've done the various elements of the paper, then you go and write an introduction. This is really all you have to write. It should be roughly 3 sentences long, sometimes a little more, but you can actually sometimes get by with less. But this basically outlines the point of the paper and the subtopics that are going to be addressed. The conclusion mirrors that introduction by reinforcing and the topics that were defined or discussed, so past tense, and then the goal being some sort of takeaway that you'd like the reader to pull off. So I added something at the end, which is, uh, if you remember one thing from this, this is what I want it to be. And so that's kind of the point of the conclusion. And with that, we've reached the end of this material. It's not necessarily the most exciting and riveting thing that you've probably ever heard, but it can be quite useful. The things that I've outlined can help you move from not a great sort of APA writer to doing adequate. There's always rooms for improvement. I'm sure that there's things that I've said that people that are more centric to the field might have issues with. But that being said, what I've done is a good way to get things done in a way that will result, generally speaking, in a positive grade. So if you have any questions about the material, do let me know. That's what I'm here for. Stay safe, and we will speak again next week.